Hello and welcome to Close Sartfield Nature Reserve. My name is Tricia and I'm the Reserves Officer for the Manx Wildlife Trust, and I'll be taking you on a tour around the site this afternoon. Close Sartfield is the Trust's flagship nature reserve, well known for the tremendous display of orchids which we'll hopefully see. Close Sartfield was purchased by the Wildlife Trust back in 1987. At that time the fields had been abandoned for a few years. Prior to that it had actually been farmed well up until the early 1980s, so many of the meadows that you walk through that are full of wildflowers were in fact growing crops of potatoes and cereals. The reserve lies on the northwestern edge of the Belaf Curragh, which is an area of special scientific interest and also a Ramsar site. In the absence of any management in the few years before the Trust bought the site, because the fields are quite small, a lot of scrub had spread into the fields, predominantly gorse and willow, and the Trust decided that they wanted to try and recreate or create wildflower meadows. So one of the first tasks which was undertaken was the clearing of gorse and willow, and after that they then embarked on a regime of cutting for hay late in the summer, and then once the grass has grown back, the fields are grazed over the winter months. And because we're cutting our hay quite late in the season, as many of the plants that you find here have got the time to flower and set seed. So that's the basic pattern of the management which we do on this site, and that applies to these sites here, these meadows here that you can see on the interpretation board. The whole site isn't managed as hay meadow. We do have other areas. So these areas here we undertake coppicing. We let some of the areas that are rough grassland, those are grazed but not cut for hay. And we have areas which are coloured green here, which are the curragh, which we're allowing to develop into woodland. The route of the Orchid Walk takes us down from the car park here out into what we call our main orchid meadow, and then we'll take a circuitous route around the reserve, having a look at the management that we do here and some of the orchids that we have growing on the site. We're now stood in Close Main, often referred to as the Orchid Meadow on the reserve. When the Trust first acquired the site back in 1987, this field was the one which gave them the indication that there may be the potential, with the right sort of management, to be able to produce wildflower meadows of this calibre. And certainly there are 100,000 easily of spotted orchids in this field today. This is possibly the only field on the reserve never to have been ploughed, although that is fairly unlikely given that most fields would have been ploughed during the war to provide food. Most of the orchids that you see here are what we call the spotted orchids. These are either Heath spotted or common spotted orchids. They are by far the two most ubiquitous orchids, so they're the ones that you're most likely to see if you're walking in the countryside. In fact, you'll often find them growing on the roadside. There's very little difference between the two species. They can both be quite a pale colour, even white, through to quite a deep pink purple colour. They do hybridise, so you'll often find it very difficult to distinguish between the two. The Heath spotted orchid flowers very slightly earlier than the common spotted, so if you see an orchid growing kind of May time, it's more than likely going to be a Heath spotted, whereas if you see an orchid later in the season, it's more than likely going to be common spotted. But at this time, which is mid-June, which is peak for the orchids, that really doesn't help a great deal because you're going to find both in profusion, especially in a field like this. Okay, so as I say, the common and the Heath spotted are the most frequently found orchids on the island. The difference between them is in the shape of the lip of the flower. I should say they're called spotted orchids because there are spots on the leaves, but unfortunately not always. With the common spotted orchid, the spots are transverse, so if you have a leaf then the spots are forming that way, With the Heath spotted orchids, if there are spots on the leaves, then they tend to be more rounded. And if you look at the petal shape, you'll see that the lower petal, or the lip, is divided into 3 parts. So there's a little gap either side of a central part, and if that middle section is shorter than the 2 on the outside, or about equal to the 2 on the outside, then you're probably looking at a Heath spotted orchid. If that central piece is much longer and the 2 on the outside tend to be more splayed, then you're looking at a common spotted orchid. Okay, so now we're looking at a common spotted orchid. So if you look at this lower petal on the flower, you'll see that it's quite deeply divided here, and that this middle part is sticking out well beyond the 2 on the outside. So that's the common spotted orchid. And the way that I get people to remember that it's the common one is that I always say that the common one is sticking its tongue out. Okay, so this is the 3rd species of orchid that we have on the site. This is the tway blade, so named because it has 2 leaves. You do actually quite frequently come across ones with 3 leaves. I don't think that's just a Manx aberration. It is actually in full flower. It has this nice spike of greeny yellow flowers. In some parts of the country it's actually called man orchid because each of the flowers looks like a little person with 2 legs, an arm and a head. So that's the common tway blade, which a lot of people would associate with being in a woodland situation, but actually we do find them quite a lot in the meadows here at Close Sartfield, but they're very difficult to spot because of these green flowers. But you find that once you get your eye in, you'll find that there are actually quite a lot. Okay, so we're now stood in Marsh Orchids, the hill field. It's not much of a hill, I admit, but it's hillier than everywhere else on the site, and I think they were probably running out of inspiration for names when they came to this meadow. Back in the late 1990s, the area that we're stood in now would have been covered in gorse. So it was a gorse like you see behind the fence there. So that's the European gorse, which was introduced to the island as a feed for horses. Now this area was dense with gorse. As a non-native, the Trust was very keen to remove it and replace it with the wildflower meadow. So we had a number of tasks to cut down the gorse. We grubbed out the roots. That left us with quite an area of bare ground. Now, rather than introduce seed, we decided to just let nature take its course and see what would come naturally. And within a very short space of time, we had the wildflowers and the grasses that you see before you now. If we weren't doing any cutting or grazing in this meadow, the gorse would very quickly come back, because if you were to walk through this area, you'd see that there are actually lots of gorse seedlings within here. Now you'll also notice that there are very few, if any, orchids growing in this part of the site. Now this is because the ground is much drier here, the soil is quite sandy, and because of that little bit of a hill, it's free draining. Now most of the orchids that we've seen so far do prefer to have slightly damper conditions. So you'll see that when we progress to the next stop, which is lower down in the meadow and where we have higher water table, then we've got a profusion of orchids again. I'm quite often asked why we left the elder tree, which is a bit of a poor specimen over on the far side there. When we removed the gorse, we unearthed the elder. And to the Manx people, it's bad luck to cut down elder, so we left that there to grow. Unfortunately, it's really no higher than it was about 20 years ago, so for all our efforts, it hasn't really done a great deal, and I'm sure it annoys the farmer that cuts our hay greatly to have to go around it. Okay, so we've now come down into the lower part of the hill field, into an area where the water table is clearly much higher than it is at the top where we were before, And you can see that we've got a corresponding fantastic increase in the number of orchids, because these are often called marsh orchids, and they prefer the damper conditions which are provided here by slight differences in the soil and the fact that the water table is much higher during the winter months. So we're now stood in the Longfield, Marley Hour, which back in 1987 was about 50% gorse. So the gorse extended from one fence over to the other side, as far as those older trees which are planted in the distance there, and quite some distance down the field. In the first few years that the Trust had the site, we didn't do a great deal of management, and in those first few years the gorse, as it will do, tended to spread, so that by 1989 the field was reportedly 75% gorse, most of which was about 7 foot high. There was a small area at what would be roughly the western end which didn't have any gorse, although it did have a little bit of willow. Now there are actually a few residential properties at the end of this field, and those people were concerned about the potential fire hazard of the gorse, so they asked the Trust to look at ways of getting rid of it. So the decision was taken to clear the gorse and try to create a wildflower meadow. So in 1990 the gorse was cleared, the field was rotivated, or the majority of it was rotivated. That then left them with getting on for 5 acres of bare ground, and at that point they started to worry about how they would actually try to reseed the area. Now at the time, one of our trustees was involved with people at Wolverhampton Polytechnic who were trying out a new method of creating wildflower meadows by using green hay. So normally if you were to cut a field for hay, you let it dry on the site, you turn it a few times, you bale it and you take it away. The idea of green hay is that as soon as it's cut, you bale it and you transport it immediately to where you're going to use it. And the idea being that you've trapped all that seed inside the hay bale. So the fields on the rest of the reserve were cut and baled. We had some hay donated by a farmer in St Jude's, and a total of 118 big round bales were brought to the field, laid out across the short distance and then unrolled like big loo rolls down the length of the field. Over the course of 3 weeks that was then turned a number of times. It was eventually rebaled and carted off site, and the hope was that they would get a wildflower meadow. And I think probably to everybody's surprise it actually worked. In the first year there was an incredible flush of eyebright and yellow rattle. In the second year there was an amazing amount of red clover. It was so red that if you were on the hills above the wildlife park you could actually see this red field. What they didn't know was at the time Wolverhampton Poly were just trialling this in little handkerchief-sized areas. And for some time this was thought to be the largest example of its kind in the British Isles of a meadow reseeded using this green hay technique. Now the Trust has used it on another of its reserves, and it's widely used throughout the UK as a method of creating or enhancing wildflower meadows. For those of you that visit the site, you'll see that on both sides of the meadow we have fence posts which are painted white, and they correspond to ones on the other side of the field. And at certain points along the way there are markers in the ground which form the corners of quadrats. So we bring out a wooden frame, and for 20 years we were recording the vegetation which was growing in those quadrats. So we've got a picture of how the site has developed over the years. Now how much of the seed came with the hay we'll never know. Obviously there would be seed in the ground dormant just waiting for the right conditions. Over the years that the Trust has had the site, material will have blown in, it will have come in on the feet of visitors plus the sheep that we have grazing the site. But I would say that by any measure it's been a great success, because we've changed what was 5 acres of gorse into 5 acres of wildflower meadow, which in a good year will have 6 species of orchid. Okay, so now we're looking at a northern marsh orchid, which is this one here. These are usually this lovely dark deep purple colour, generally fairly low growing. They don't like a lot of competition and they tend to be in the wetter parts of the site. And again, if you're looking at the lip of the flower, whereas with the spotted orchids there was that little division and the bit sticking out, the lip of the northern marsh orchid is triangular in shape. And you do quite often get hybrids between the northern marsh and one of the spotted orchids. So if you see an orchid which is quite tall and has a big spike of flowers, it'll often be a hybrid, and it's quite often a hybrid with one of the northern marsh. Right, that brings us to the end of our virtual tour of Close Sartfield and its orchids. If you do decide to come and have a visit for yourself, please stick to the paths. We've introduced a one-way system this year to try and maintain social distances. We've also put in some passing places. And if you'd like to make a donation to the Wildlife Trust, then please take a look at our website. Thank you very much.